Tonight I want to talk about a message that I've entitled The Transformed Life. And really my heart behind this is that, a lot of people can say, I've come to Jesus, or I go to church now, or I do this or do that, and, I'm a Christian now, or whatever. And that's all good, and I'm glad people, say things like that. But the reality is when you've had a true encounter with God, you are transformed in some way. There's a transformation that takes place. And that transformation moves you to action in some way. And so I'm actually going to go Old Testament tonight, and I want to talk about a guy in the Old Testament that had an encounter with the living God, had a transformation in his life take place, and ended up, it moved him to action. And I know that you'll be blessed when you hear it. It's one of my favorite stories of the Old Testament because it's so unique. We're going to be talking about a guy named Naaman today, and we're going to be in 2 Kings chapter 5, and we're going to read some verses here and just kind of set this story up before we get into it tonight. It says, "Now Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. And she said to her mistress, 'If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy.' Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. 'By all means go,' the king of Aram replied. 'I will send a letter to the king of Israel.' And so Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read this: 'With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you so that you may cure him of his leprosy.' As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, 'Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he's trying to pick a quarrel with me?' When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message: 'Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel.' So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to him and said, 'Go and wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed.' But Naaman went away angry, and he said, 'I thought,'" everyone say, "I thought." Okay, remember that, because that usually gets us in trouble when we think. He says, "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of his God, wave his hand over the spot, and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Paphar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned and went off in a rage. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, 'Washed and be cleansed'?" These two guys need to get a raise. So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. And then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. So please accept a gift from your servant." The prophet answered, "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. "If you will not," said Naaman, "please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord. But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon," which is a pagan god, "to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I have to bow there also. When I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this." "Go in peace," Elisha said. What a story. What an amazing story here. There's a lot going on here. We're going to just take this apart a little bit for the next few minutes. Naaman is a commander-in-chief of all of the armies of Damascus. He's well known. His reputation precedes him. He's a hero in his country. He was admired by the great and the mighty of that day. The king of Syria loved him. The people of the land worshipped him. They adored him. They were devoted to him. As far as we know, he was an honorable man. He had delivered Syria many times in battle. He was a mighty man of valor. But he had this one issue, and the issue was that he was a leper. Naaman had favor with the king because we know that the king was willing to do whatever it took to see his friend healed of this leprosy. And the king of Aram said, "By all means, go. I'm going to send a letter on ahead of you to the king of Israel." And this would have been normal in that day, to reach out from king to king. When we read of the story of Jesus being born, the Magi came. The first thing they did when they got into town was go to Herod's palace. That would have been a common thing. It would have been just proper procedure. And we see here in this story that in their minds, the king had something to do with the healing of this leprosy. They were going to go right to the top. They weren't going to mess around with anyone. They were going to go right to the top man, and he was going to get healed. So the king of Syria writes this letter, and when the king of Israel reads it, he is absolutely freaked out and feels like it's a trap. And Elisha hears about his response, and Elisha finally just reaches out and says, "Hey, why don't you send him to my home? Just have him come to my home, and we'll see what happens." And the next thing we know, Naaman and his entourage, all of his horses and chariots and servants and everyone, they all show up at this humble little cottage of this prophet named Elisha. They just show up right at his door. And what I think is amazing about this story is that Elisha doesn't even come out to greet him. He sends one of his servants to say, just go down to the Jordan and dunk 7 times. And Naaman he flips out. Like, he feels so disrespected. He feels like, really, that's the best you could do? Do you know who I am? Do you know my reputation? And he doesn't even go to the door. Now, that might sound disrespectful, but when you know what's really going on here, God is so genius when it comes to breaking down things in our life that we need broken down so that we can receive what he has for us. The first thing is that Naaman had come from a pagan culture and environment, and it was filled with sorcerers and false miracle workers. And so Naaman was accustomed to the fact that these guys in their robes would come out and they would do magic and claim it as being legitimate healing. And it was all a sham. And he was used to that. And I love what, he's coming there expecting something like that, and God does things in a more simple way. In fact, Elisha stays in the background, and he's really pointing Naaman to God himself in a strange way. He was expecting the show, the illusion. He was expecting all that. That's all he knew. The other thing is that Naaman was accustomed to all of the people completely being submissive to him. In his pride and in his military background and in his popularity, people were always, just honoring him and making all over him like he was somebody. He was probably looking for some special honor and some special treatment so that he would be healed of his leprosy in front of all. But God wanted to show Naaman that he is no respecter of persons or position or rank or wealth. Go and dunk in that muddy Jordan River. Kim and I actually drove over the Jordan River in the West Bank area near Galilee, and it's not as impressive as what you'd think, trust me. Just go in that muddy river. And that's why he argued. He said, we've got better rivers where I come from. Why would I want to go in a muddy river to be clean? I want to go to a clean river to be clean. The other thing that was going on was that God was intending to destroy the pride in Naaman's life through humbling him with this request. There he is with his servants, his entourage, his staff, his horses, his chariots. He brought all kinds of gold and silver with him and all kinds of clothes. And he came for some great climactic event. And like what happens in my life most of the time, most of what he received here was anticlimactic. You ever been thinking that God's really going to do something and it just turns out to be like, really? That was it? That was it? God says, go down and wash in this muddy Jordan and you'll be healed. And Naaman turns red hot. This is such an insult to his nobility and his dignity and to his position as commander-in-chief. How dare him? And he turned and went away in his rage. And what he was saying was, I'd rather keep my pride with my leprosy than to bow and yield and be healed of it. But the issue that God saw was simply this, is that Naaman thought that he himself, in his wealth and riches, in his position, had all the resources he needed for his healing and salvation. And the thing is that God was trying to teach him that you can't do this yourself. This is bigger than anything you brought with you. Naaman had to learn that prestige and money and reputation won't buy God's grace. You must come to God with nothing. I love Tim Keller shared that a pastor friend of his from London once said that if you want to be a Christian, all you need is nothing, and most people don't have it. Once grace transforms you, then it'll move you to something. It'll move you to action. And so I want to share with you tonight 3 ways that Naaman was transformed and moved to action. The first way is mentally. His whole world view changed in an instant. He came with a worldview from a Syrian background, a pagan background, did not know the God of Israel, and he's humbled. We see how God just starts to dismantle his pride in this story, and he ends up obeying because he realizes he might as well, and he comes out, and the first thing he says is that now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. Man, what a change. What a transformation in his thinking. This man who was used to controlling thousands upon thousands of men now is admitting, when he sees his skin completely clean, that there is no other God but this God. So he had a radical mentality shift of his worldview, a radical transformation in that moved him into action. The second way that he was transformed and moved to action was regarding his possessions. The greatest way to know that you've had an experience with God is when you start looking at your possessions different. It's not wrong to have things. It's wrong when things have you. And God will start dealing with the things closest to your heart. And most of the time, it's your wallet. And so this starts to happen, and his attitude towards his riches radically changed here. So do you remember that he brought all this money with him? Do you remember that in the beginning of the story? The silver and the gold and the clothes. What he was going to do was he was going to give the man of God all of that money to purchase his healing. But now he's in a position where he's healed, and he doesn't have to do anything. He can take it back with him. What a deal. Didn't cost him a dime. But that's not what he does. What does he do? He's already healed, and he offers all of his possessions to Elisha as a gift, as a blessing. Not to buy anything. That's already been done. But now to be a blessing. And you know what? He didn't have to do that, but he had a heart change when it came to his possessions. Many scholars agree that had Elisha taken the money that Naaman offered him, that he would have been the richest man in all of Israel at the time. And there's another way, and this is probably the most important thing that I see here in this story, another way that Naaman was moved to action, and that was this. That God, through his miraculous healing power, transformed Naaman to the point that he was willing to bring his faith into every area of his life. Now, there's probably something that you missed tonight. Maybe we read over it and it really didn't hit you, but I just want to share this with you tonight because I feel like it's just so important. So, coming to see Elisha, the things that would have been important to Naaman were his reputation, his health, his possessions, all of that. And now he's standing there completely healed. He's basically acknowledging that there's a God in Israel that he wants to pursue. He's basically saying, Elisha, I'm willing to give you everything I've got right now. But you know what became the most valuable thing to him? Dirt. What does he ask Elisha? He says, if you'll permit me, if I could carry as much dirt back with me, back to my homeland, that would be a blessing to me. And you're like, dirt. But let me set this up because he really explains it in this story. You see, he served his king. His king was elderly. His king served a false god in a pagan temple, the god of Ramon. And so his king would come into the temple, and he couldn't kneel by himself, so he would literally lean on the shoulders of Naaman, and they would kneel down together, and Naaman would kneel, and his king would be leaning on his shoulder, and when it was time to get up, he would help his king up. But now, because Naaman said, this is important to me, to worship the God of Israel, what he was going to do now is when he walked into that temple, he was going to pour out some of that dirt from Israel. When he had to kneel, he would kneel on that dirt, telling everybody in that temple that I'm going to serve my king, I'm going to be faithful to my king, but I will not bow to any other God than the God of Israel. And isn't that really the goal? That you and I bring our faith into every area of our life? God has, this is the thing that blows my mind. Naaman could have stayed in Israel. He could have just said, I found the God that I've been looking for my whole life. I've got everything I'm going to stay here. But no, he said, I want to go back to my pagan culture. I want to go back and serve my leaders, but I want to tell the world that I serve the God of Israel. I just want to encourage you that God doesn't want to put you in a bubble to where you're just around Christians all day long. What a boring, horrible life that would be. Once a week's enough. No, I'm just kidding. But you don't know, Pastor Mike, where I work. It's probably bad. It's probably pagan. Especially like our office, right? Allie? Pagan. Totally pagan. But see, God wants you and I to bring our faith into every area of our life. To bring our faith into circles where maybe nobody in the circle believes in God. Maybe nobody in that circle believes the way you do about a host of things. But God has called you and I, when we walk into an environment that maybe sometimes is even hostile, that symbolically, spiritually, I want you to think of it this way. As you walk into that situation, maybe even tomorrow at work, you're pouring out dirt on the floor, and you're going to kneel before the God of Israel, and you're not going to bow to the God of that situation. Naaman really summed it up in my mind of what a true believer that's transformed is like. It moves us to action. I'd like to have our host start to distribute the communion elements at this time. And as we do that, they're just going to pass these out to you. I want you to just listen here because I'm going to share with you, I think, one of the most important points of this story right now. Who is the real hero of this story? Now, many people would say, well, it's got to be Elisha. It's got to be his servants. It's God. Who's the real hero in this story? The real hero in this story is the little girl we read about in verse 2. Let me share with you a little bit about this little girl. It's amazing to me that this chapter starts off with this great commander-in-chief that scriptures talk about and his reputation. And then in verse 2, it mentions a little girl. And this is what we know about this little girl according to scripture, that she was a captive girl, that she was a slave girl, that she was an orphan. She had been one of the thousands that had been captured in one of the raids by the Assyrians upon northern Israel. Her parents were most likely murdered by the Assyrians. She had been sold into slavery and had stood on the auction block and ended up serving in Naaman's household. Being that Naaman was the army commander, it was quite possible that Naaman was one of the ones that ordered the invasion. But what I see in this story that makes her the real hero is that instead of looking upon her future and all her life in despair and desperation, she had the courage to be a blessing to her captors. This slave girl must have understood something about forgiveness, because it was her words. And we know that she was a blessing to his household because this great commander-in-chief listened to the words of a little girl that was a slave. So she had been a blessing to this household. She had gained some sort of credibility, some sort of favor. And in all of the horror that she had been through, she told her captors about a God in Israel and prayed for the health of Naaman. This little girl was away from her home and away from her country, but she never forgot her God. She had an unwavering faith in him. It seems that her attitude set this whole thing in motion. But what I love about the story is that, like so many of us, we complicate things and add things to it that God never adds. When she told Naaman about the prophet in Israel, she made no mention of cost, did she? She made no mention about going to the king. She said nothing about government, nothing about bringing his mighty entourage with him. Naaman added all these things to it because he had a lot of preconceived ideas. He said, I thought that Elisha would come out and greet me, and I thought that there'd be this big event, and I thought it was going to go down this way. And that was the issue. God had to break that in his life. And when Elijah came back, when he came back to Elisha, Naaman was a completely different man. He was no longer proud or conceited. In his mind, he was no longer this great military general. He was a man that wanted to serve the living God. He was humble. He was yielded. He was contrite. He was grateful. God had not only healed him of his leprosy, but God transformed him to move in action and to take a stand in front of everybody